Hi there, you are listening to the Guitar Speak podcast. My name is Matt Wakeling and thank you so much for joining me. Here we are in Sydney, Australia, producing our podcast and distributing it around the world on the World Wide Web, of course. Thanks for listening. We are getting listeners from all over the world, which is really amazing. We've only been running for about 5 or 6 months and already the response has been great. So thank you. If you're one of our regular listeners, if this is your first time tuning in, great to have you as well, of course. Today we've got an international guest, Gretchen Menn, a fantastic US-based guitar player. We had a great conversation with her about her really broad career. I knew of her as a rock instrumentalist, but there is so much more to Gretchen than just that, and we'll find out about that. All right, but before we move on to that interview, bit of a heads up. Our good friend Michael Dolce. Now you'll know Michael. He was our very first guest on the show, and just a couple of episodes back on episode 15, that episode covered actually going to one of Michael's master classes. He is a fantastic guitar player and a fantastic teacher. And if you heard that episode, you know that I left that place thoroughly inspired, as did some of the other guys in the workshop as well. So if you want to know what happens at our Michael Dolce Guitar Clinic, tune into episode 15. Have a listen to that past episode. But we want to let you know Michael's got a whole bunch of new dates coming up in October and November. October the 4th, he'll be in Sydney. October the 5th in Queensland. The 13th down in Melbourne. The 18th in Canberra. 26th out west at Dubbo. Newcastle, the 7th and 14th of November. And there are dates in New Zealand and Perth to come. So if you're anywhere near those cities or those centres, it is so worth getting to a Michael Dolce masterclass. Now, to celebrate and promote these classes coming up, Michael is partnering with us, the Guitar Speak podcast, with a massive giveaway. There's some really cool stuff now. The details are being put together as I speak. So what you really need to do is keep an eye on our Facebook page, Guitar Speak Podcast on Facebook, and also Michael Dolce Music on Facebook. And there'll be details about stuff coming out. But Michael's organised some really great stuff to give away, so it's definitely worth checking out. All right. Hey, just a little bit of context. By the way, it is September the 10th, 2016 in Sydney as I record this. So if it's 2017, we're not giving stuff away anymore. You've missed it, because I know people dig through our back catalogue. But as of today, that's what's happening. Anyway, back to our featured artist for today, Gretchen Menn. As I said, I just had a great time talking to Gretchen and finding about her career. So let's go to that right now. Okay, Gretchen, welcome to the Guitar Speak podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, I first knew of you as an instrumental rock guitarist, and you've had a great career doing that stuff. But recently, and I feel like I'm a bit late to the party, but I've realised you've got a really deep classical guitar background. What came first, the classical music, or were you always a rock player?
That's a good question. I would. It's not an easy answer, actually. I think because I would say I almost sort of started at the same time, and I feel like my love for both worlds developed around the same time as well. Mm-hmm. Which is that my parents were both very musically diverse, and from the time I was a little kid, actually, I think I probably was exposed to classical music earlier. Like, my mom was always really intent on taking me and my sister to like the ballet, and we were even going to see operas when we were like little kids, because she was just really into making sure her kids got, some cultural enrichment.
Wow, cool.
But then, around the requisite age, I got into, rock music, and actually, I guess a little bit before rock. I liked, I remember having Elvis albums and, David Bowie and Michael Jackson as a little kid.
Sure.
Then,
so like on the radio around the house sort of a thing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I remember my dad had like Michael Jackson's Thriller, and just being like, a little kid and thinking like, this is just so thrilling, especially with the video that has the zombies, and you're like scared of the video, but it's also really exciting. So I liked that stuff, but I was a normal little kid. I took the requisite piano lessons, but I played outside. I wasn't inside practicing an instrument. But around, I think 15 is the age of Led Zeppelin for most kids or
Okay,
thereabouts.
Yeah, it sounds about right.
That's when I got into things like, Led Zeppelin and AC/DC, which is actually more of the music of my parents' generation, but that's what was in, like, at my high school. Like, there were people who were listening to, the modern stuff, grunge and all of that. But like, it was more like that all my friends kind of realized that our parents really had cool albums. So I remember listening, my friends and I making each other like mixtapes of like, Led Zeppelin and Cream and AC/DC and
Cool.
Creedence Clearwater and,
Nice.
all sorts of stuff. And because I was getting interested in raiding my dad's record collection, that's when I started discovering more guitar-oriented stuff. And that was also around the time that my dad, who was a music journalist, was like, honey, do you know what I do? It's like, I feel like most kids, I kind of reduced my parents' occupations to like simple one word, compartments in my brain.
Sure.
So my dad was a writer, and I guess if pressed, I could say, I guess maybe it had something to do with guitars. It was GPI. I remember that when I would call him at work. And that's when he was like, honey, like, I actually know something about this. And, my parents are both cool. So it wasn't like it was a revelation that they might know something
Sure.
cool. But that's when I was like, wait, you mean you like actually really do know this stuff? And that's when I started, he was thinking like, okay, you like Eric Johnson. Have you heard of Steve Morse? You like Jimmy Page? Have you heard of Jeff Beck? Here's a Johnny Winter album.
He was the editor of Guitar Player at some stage.
He was.
Yeah,
he
cool.
was. And I won't say it's unfortunate, but I think a common misconception was that somehow he guided me in that direction, which he really didn't. Both my parents always said that they would just kind of wanted me to figure out what I wanted to do, but it just sort of happened through being a natural, just adolescence. You get into rock guitar because that's what you get into around that time.
Cool.
And he happened to be able to point me in the right direction. And
that's great.
Actually, by the time I started playing guitar, he hadn't been at Guitar Player magazine for a few years.
Okay.
So, so there wasn't overlap in that, but certainly a lot of, hey, if you like Steve Vai, you should also check out, Yngwie Malmsteen. And,
sure.
He knew his guitar players.
That's awesome. So you're listening to all this stuff?
Yeah, so I'm listening to all this stuff, but at the same time, I'm also listening. I got into things like, I think my dad turned me on to Django Reinhardt. And then Frank Zappa and the Dixie Dregs. Like, I actually remember going to see, it was one of those things where like, okay, my dad's like, okay, you like Joe Satriani and Steve Vai and Eric Johnson, we're going to go see Steve Morse play at Stanford. And so I remember going, and I was like 15 and going to see Steve Morse play and just like having my mind blown. Like, I mean, because he seemed so normal and so down to earth, and he wasn't doing things that like a lot of rock stars do in terms of like the flamboyant, costuming or anything like that.
Sure.
And so you just think like, oh, this guy just seems like such a nice, normal guy. And then he gets up on stage and just annihilates everyone. So I started getting in like kind of early on, like very shortly after Led Zeppelin is when I was like buying every Dixie Dregs album. And right around the time, I think I got, 40 Frank Zappa albums and super into Django Reinhardt.
Cool.
But then by the time I got to college is when, and at that point I had a guitar, but I feel like at least growing up, so where I live in California, it's basically a town that Stanford University's in. And so it's a town that has since become very unaffordable, but at least when I was growing up, it's always been very academic. And so from, even the public schools, they have you thinking from a very early age, like, unless you're getting straight A's, like basically, like, who knows what could happen to you? Like, you will never be accepted in a college, and therefore, like, your life will be over.
Sure.
But that's like, it's the mentality of the region. And so even though I was really interested in music at the time, it's like that was the year that we're taking SATs and we're having to apply for colleges and things like that. And so it's like, okay, yeah, I had a guitar, I picked it up, I had a couple of lessons, but there wasn't time for that. I was just completely immersed in trying to, you know, get my future planned out.
Okay, yeah.
So it was really once I got to college, my first year of school, that I was like, that I had heard that the classical guitar teacher for all 5 colleges, his name is Philip DeFremery. I remember another guitar player telling me like, hey, Philip DeFremery, oh, you know, he's amazing. He was a student of Segovia.
Wow.
And he has perfect pitch and the most insane ear imaginable. And he has perfect technique, and all of his students end up with perfect technique. And I thought, okay, sign me up for the course in perfect technique, you know. And for me, it wasn't a stretch. I always loved classical music.
Sure. Yeah, you'd already been exposed.
Right. And so I signed up for lessons with him. And to this day, I mean, I cannot say enough good about him and how fundamental he was in my even thinking it could be an option to go on to be a professional guitarist. Mm-hmm. You know, it's very easy for people to get it in their mind if you didn't start, you know, when you're in the single digits of age, that there's not going to be any future for you. And I remember kind of saying something a little offhanded to him about, you know, my estimations of my, you know, future or abilities. And he was very serious about it. He was like, no, like he cut that thinking off pretty quickly and was very, very clearly, he seemed to believe I could be a professional musician. And, you know, nothing like having a mentor or a hero believe in you to at least give you enough of a, well, maybe this is possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And make you, you know, and I feel like that what I always appreciate about his teaching so much is he taught me from day one as though I would be a professional musician. He didn't teach me as somebody who is coming to guitar, you know, a little bit later. You know,
Sure.
First year of college to start guitar is, you know, by a lot of standards, really, really late.
Yeah. Now in America, so college that's the step after high school?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So it's when you're like 18 years old.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, I studied with him. I graduated a year early, so I had 3 years of study with him.
Okay.
But you know, that was I've since actually made some pilgrimages to the East Coast. So I live in California.
Yep.
My school was in Massachusetts. So I've actually done times where I've flown out there for like, you know, 3 or 4 days and just done basically like a master class of like just 6 hours a day for, you know, 2 or 3 days when I can with him.
Great. So he's on the East Coast now?
Yeah, he is. He teaches for the there's a 5 college area in New England and Massachusetts, and it's for Amherst, Smith, Mount Holyoke, UMass, and Hampshire colleges.
Cool. So you've done 3 years of classical study. Are you playing out? Are you doing anything with it, or are you just amassing a repertoire?
Well, okay. So what was a little bit, I think what had a lot to do with the path I took is because, okay, so I graduated in 3 years, which at least here is kind of like a year sooner than you normally would.
Okay.
But it had to do with, you know, courses I had taken in high school. So I ended up showing up to college already with some college credit.
Okay, great.
So even though it's like, yeah, it's sure nice to save a year of tuition, because at least out here, like, school is not free.
Right, yep.
And, you know, you can come out of school, you know, barely not a teenager with, you know, enough debt to last you a good chunk of your lifetime. So, you know, saving a year of tuition was definitely very enticing.
Yeah, wow.
But what it also meant is that, you know, I had this degree in music and I'd been playing it for 3 years, which is ridiculous. Like, it wasn't like I'd been playing for 3 years and I sounded like had been playing for 20. No, I sounded, you know, like somebody who'd been playing music seriously for 3 years.
Okay.
So I still needed more time under my belt. I needed more experience, and I needed, it would have been perfectly preposterous for me to go and get a master's degree, you know, at that point. And also because, you know, having grown up in an academic town and having kind of just always been in academia, like, I didn't want to just be somebody who was always under that kind of umbrella.
Okay.
As much as I love it, I know I could always go back, and that it would be something that that would be like a comfort zone.
Sure. I was going to ask with the degree. So obviously you're working on your playing, but what sort of academic work were you engaged in?
I studied music as well, so I was studying, music composition.
Hmm.
It was a general music major at the school that I went to.
Okay.
It was a small department, which meant, there wasn't like a huge variety of classes, but it didn't matter. The classes were fantastic, and because it was a small department, it meant that, I got to actually, I took we didn't have TAs teaching classes. You'd be in a class with a professor, and by your senior year, you'd be in a class with fewer than 10 people in it.
Okay,
So you
great.
get a lot of great specialized teaching
Yeah,
from the
cool. That's
professors.
so good.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So at that point, I had been also working on electric guitar and trying to apply what I was learning in the classroom about like theory and stuff,
Hmm.
as well as the knowledge I was picking up on some technical stuff on classical guitar. I was trying to apply that to the electric. So a lot of my electric playing, I won't call it self-taught, because I was certainly being taught about, the rudiments or the building blocks of music. But I had only very, very few lessons on electric guitar,
Okay.
and nothing, with a consistent teacher for long periods of time. It'd be like, 3 or 4 lessons from one guy, and then work on stuff for, you know, years by myself, and then
Sure.
go in and take 2 lessons from this other guy, or
Yeah.
things like
And what
that.
would you learn? Would you learn songs, techniques? What kind of stuff?
Um, on electric
Yeah.
guitar, let's see. Let me try to remember. Like my very, very first lesson when I was in high school, it was like learning songs.
Sure.
I actually still remember my first guitar teacher, who I'm good friends with still. His name's Sam Eigen, and he's recently been playing with Smash
Wow,
Mouth.
great.
He's a great guitar player, one of my dearest friends. And I still remember, I mean, bless the man. I remember being, 15 years old and being like, can I learn Too Many Notes by Steve Morse? And he's like, okay. And he tabbed it out for me.
Cool.
I was like, how many teachers would not just like laugh at your student and just be like, are you kidding me? Like, but he did it. Not that I could like play it well, but I remember sitting there and working on the alternate picking.
Yeah.
But then with other teachers, it would be everything from one guy I worked with a bit on kind of like a jazz approach to improvisation, which obviously one cannot master in a handful of lessons,
Yeah,
but
sure.
it still gave me some basic things to think about, and some awareness of some concepts that have been helpful.
Cool. What about bands?
Yeah.
Did you end up playing in bands, jamming, that kind of thing?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I feel like maybe because of my late start to music, one of the things that I really missed out on was having kind of a casual camaraderie, like being able to just get together and learn my instrument with other people who were learning their instruments. So it was kind of like I had to get myself prepared to play in bands, and then it was like immediately then being professional, which is a little bit hilarious and daunting, when you think about it, because it means that it's like you're showing up for a paid gig, and like you have to sit there and actually ask people, what do I do at sound check? Like I really don't know what to do. I don't want to look like an idiot on stage. So you're kind of growing up in front of people who are expecting you to be professional. On the other hand, the good thing about it is you learn really fast.
Sure, yeah.
So yeah, I started playing in bands, like right out of college. And things of various longevity and various degrees of seriousness. And really the first, I'd say, true, like serious professional band I was in was an AC/DC tribute band, which, easy enough. I loved AC/DC.
Great.
And I recognized that from a classical kind of, with more classical training, that unless I wanted to be like the biggest bore ever to watch on stage, that it would be fantastic to play music I loved in a rock band, where my very role in the band mandated a certain amount of, of stage presence. You can't be Angus and stand still,
Exactly,
so.
yeah. So you took the Angus role in the band?
I did. I did. My first real.
Now, your stage name was
first
awesome. What was your
professional
stage name?
they all took on the feminized versions of. So I was Agnes Young.
That's great.
But that was carried over. That was attached to the role, not to
Sure.
me, because the girl before me was Agnes. The girl who's in there now is Agnes.
Yeah, right.
But yeah,
that's great.
But it's actually just as well, because I mean, not to minimize the band. I mean, they were fantastic for what they did, but it's more like, some of my first gigs ever. Those aren't, I don't think most people would really want their first gigs ever like publicized.
Sure. Sure.
Now in the days of, cameras and YouTube, we're accountable for everything, including, the maturing that we do over the course of a career.
Yeah. So how'd you learn the material? I gather you're a pretty good reader from all the classical work. How did you learn the AC/DC repertoire?
Actually, I did that all by ear, I think.
Okay, cool.
And I might have, I don't have any AC/DC tab books. So maybe I referred to them sometimes, but I just remember doing a lot of pausing and rewinding.
Yeah, sure.
Like a lot of it, because at that point, like I guess they were making things that slowed things down. That you could keep in pitch, but it's like I was just out of college. Like I didn't have any money, so like I had my CD player, and I would play, pause, rewind, play, pause, rewind. Yep. I just remember doing a lot of that.
Great, that's cool. A lot of classical musicians, ones I've come across with, some of them are great at slotting into a band and really modifying their approach. Some of them really need the dots in front of them. So. The fact that you work that stuff out by ear, that's great. That shows two very different sides, I guess, of your guitar discipline. So cool. So you're rocking out as was it Agnes Young?
Agnes Young.
That's
yeah,
so good.
Headbanging, dot quacking.
Awesome. Playing the licks. Were you playing in SG? Were you
I was.
doing the gear
I
as
still
well?
have it.
Wow, cool.
Yeah,
nice.
SG and Old Marshall. I still have them both.
Fantastic. And you ended up in a Zeppelin band, Zepparella. Did that follow on from the AC/DC show?
It did, yeah. It started actually, I think, about maybe a year and a half. I was only in AC/DC for I think 2 years, and then so Zepparella started because Clementine, the drummer who I met in AC/DC, she and I were just wanting to play more. It's like in any band, you have people who have, you just have different personalities, different people wanting to have the band mean, whatever to them. And
sure.
Usually by default, the people who want to play the least get their way, and Clementine and I were wanting to play more. And so she suggested that we do this as a way of kind of like anytime, say, the girls from AC/DC didn't want to play and had the dates blocked out of the calendar, we were like, okay, well, we can still play, but we'll be learning the Zeppelin catalog, which we wanted to do anyway.
Yeah, great.
And we'll be more accountable, and we'll do it better if we know we're going to be doing it on stage.
Yep.
I'm sorry, I have a very loud cat who's talking to me.
Oh, yeah.
If you hear
that's
it.
one of your things. That's.
Yes. But every now and then you hear them howling in the background. I think the iPhone kind of amplifies it. So we started doing that just really as a way of kind of keeping ourselves busier. But then the girls in AC/DC didn't like the idea of us doing both, so they fired us.
Okay.
And so Zepparella got very free.
Okay. Cool. And you're still doing that now. That's been ongoing.
I am. You know what? It's incredible. Like, I mean, not to say that I never was bored or anything with doing AC/DC, but it's incredible that the catalog of Zeppelin, it's so diverse, and it's both in terms of kind of technical things and for a guitar player, but also in terms of like the emotional spectrum. It really survives. It survives a lot of years and a lot of study. And it's a lot of fun to play. Like I always say, like, in what other situation are you going to be able to play, the heaviest, most headbanging riffs with like heartbreaking, acoustic stuff or, really delicate dynamic stuff, and then abuse a Les Paul with a bow. It's like, there's just, you don't get to have that kind of fun. It's Led Zeppelin's an amusement park for a guitar player.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a meaty, Yeah, guitar gig. That's cool. What do you get when you really get inside a player's head, which you obviously did with with
Mm-hmm.
Angus's style and then Jimmy Page's stuff?
Mm-hmm.
What do you take from that when you really study intricately one player's style?
Oh God, that is such a good question. Um, I think I think what it does is like we learn any language truly, any language in which we're fluently native speaking. We learn it
Hmm.
imitatively. So you can sit in a classroom, sure, and I have, and I did, and I think it's beneficial. And you can learn the building blocks of music, and you can learn some of the conventions. But the way that you really develop your own vocabulary, I would say, is more by imitation. We imitate our parents when we're babies.
Hmm.
You know, later on we imitate our teachers and our friends. And through the more exposure you have, the more you amass a vocabulary that allows you to say things that are truly yours.
Sure.
You know, if we only had one influence, if we only interacted with one other person, would sure sound a lot like that other person.
Yeah, absolutely.
So getting into the minds and the finger positions of some of my heroes allows me to better see where my own voice might eventually fit into the picture. I mean, I think it was Miles Davis who said something like, "Man, it takes a long time to sound like yourself." You know, so finding your own voice is, you know, a lifelong process
Yeah,
probably,
yeah.
but you know, by getting to actually learn and get to get paid to learn, some of my favorite stuff is, you know, what an incredible blessing and education, and ultimately it's enrichment for my own vocabulary. I would actually really caution anybody against taking gigs if they don't love the music, because whether or not you want it to, what you play will influence how you sound. So if you're playing music you don't like, you're going to start creating music you don't
Hmm.
like. I think, or you run the risk of it, you know. So it's like beware of the company you keep, and you know, make sure that the time you spend learning something is stuff that you really do like and enjoy and want to become part of your musical vocabulary and voice.
Yeah, cool. The so at some stage you've moved over to writing your own stuff. What other influences do you bring? Like you've mentioned Steve Morse a lot. You mentioned the alternate picking, for example, which I hear a lot in your playing. I think yeah, you've
Mm.
really got a tight command of that stuff. So is that for example, is that like a direct sort of Steve Morse
Oh
thing?
yeah. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, my picking hand, I feel like a Steve Morse fan can spot me as a Steve Morse fan by a photo of looking at my right hand.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a very specific way to
Hmm.
play, and um, I for a long time had switched back and forth. Like initially, I played with a traditional picking method, and I think there's even some photos of me holding my pick in the traditional way. And every now and then, I still kind of go back to it and go, you know, there's definitely some advantage. And I actually remember Steve was so kind, having a whole long discussion with him about my picking crisis,
Wow.
because
What was the
I had
crisis?
the crisis was feeling like that the traditional picking method that every teacher tells you to do, that you see all these guitar players with, you know, fantastic technique using,
Hmm.
of it never quite feeling comfortable for me. And actually, you know, Steve was kind enough to for me to kind of pick his brain and say, like, can you tell me about the way you pick and why? Because I found myself wanting to have my wrist in that position anyway, just because I actually found it more
Hmm.
comfortable. I felt like it didn't make my shoulders stick out so strange. I felt like it helped me mute the strings
Yeah.
better. And he was so kind. He just gave me this whole list of why he picks the way he does and the advantages and disadvantages. And that's when I really realized, okay, you know, I never have wanted to be you know, a direct descendant from any one of my heroes. Not
Sure.
that I would flatter myself to say I would ever be a clone of them,
Hmm.
but it made me realize, you know what, a lot of what I respond to in Steve's playing, and you know, it's because it resonates with something in me. You know, we have our own inherent tastes, and when something resonates with us, you know, that tells us about ourselves. And so that's when I thought, okay, you know what? I am going to try picking like this for a while. And it would just like so much came together for
Wow.
me. I mean, and still there are definitely times, just as Steve would say, like some of the limitations are things like speed. It's very true. Like there are times like the number of times I actually pick up my pick in a traditional method, it's more like, I don't know, a couple times a year just to check in with it and be like, do I still prefer to pick this way? And it's true, like without even practicing, you can play stuff way faster holding it in that traditional way. But in terms of some of the complex string jumps,
Yeah.
I can't do that with a traditional pick hold. Whereas having that anchored hand just really helps if you're doing like alternate pick with, across strings or, skipping strings.
So when you say anchored, are you using have you got, like, say, your pinky is actually touching the guitar to connect your hand? How are you doing that?
Okay, so what it is like in the traditional picking method, you have sort of like the palm of your hand
Yep.
muting the strings you're not playing. The way that I hold my pick is I have my pinky extended. So if I'm playing on the low strings, my pinky's muting all the higher strings.
Okay.
And then as I'm like, if I'm playing the higher strings and then my palm is muting the lower strings, I still, my pinky can do things like do volume swells or flip the pickups, the pickup switch, or, basically it keeps your pinky from being just sort of this, useless appendage, and actually puts it to work doing things like pickup changes or volume swells or tone adjustments or whatever.
Okay, yeah. How about another influence? I read that you studied Frank Zappa's composition in a lot of detail in college. Can you tell me something about that?
Yeah. Okay, so my school was very, very classically traditional. Yeah, I don't even know if we had any jazz classes. Like it's very classical focused, which again, it's great. I love classical. But by my senior year, I got it in my brain that I just wanted to do a special studies project. And so, despite being very classical, my school is also very progressive. And if you went to a professor in the department and pitched them on an idea of a course of study and outlined why that should be relevant to your degree and got it approved and the professor would oversee it, then you could basically come up with your own class. And so that's what I did. There was a great, very progressive teacher named Raphael Atlas at my school, and I loved him. And I basically came to him and said, here's what I want to do. Here's why Frank Zappa is relevant. He's not just sort of a quirky rock musician. He's doing stuff with the Ensemble Moderne, and Pierre Boulez is conducting his stuff. And so I kind of with him outlined a course of study, and it was sort of in multiple parts. Like one of it was sort of like a biographical historical, more like musicology approach to sort of him, which was necessary because the department actually didn't know anything about him, or very little.
Okay.
And then I did an analysis of The Girl in the Magnesium Dress and the Shake Your Booty Tango. And I remember actually I think the transcriptions I had were the ones, if I'm not mistaken, that Steve, well, not The Girl in the Magnesium Dress, but the Shake Your Booty Tango. I believe that might have been Steve Vai's transcription, because Steve Vai met Frank Zappa, I think, when he was a student at Berkeley, and he was just transcribing all of his stuff. And that's how Frank was like, there's this kid at Berkeley who's transcribing my music. So I think that I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure that the Shake Your Booty Tango is a Steve Vai transcription.
Wow, cool.
Yeah.
Nice. Frank Zappa, I mean, to me, he always seemed more like a 20th century composer who happened to have a rock band or who happened to wail on the guitar. But it seemed to...
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Boulez is like an obvious connection, as you said. But yeah, he just seemed to continue and subvert, I guess, that the 20th century classical. Did you do much 20th century in your course when you said you did? Obviously, it was a classical. Did they move into the 20th century stuff?
Yeah, I mean, like Schoenberg, Stravinsky, like 20th century art, orchestral music, yes. But things like Miles Davis, no.
Sure. Sure.
Maybe I shouldn't do them a disservice. There may have been a history of jazz class. There may have been, but if there was, it was probably only one, and it was probably not offered every semester.
Sure, sure. With your own stuff, like again on your solo album, I wouldn't say it has a Frank Zappa aesthetic, but there's definitely places where you stretch the idea of rock composition in terms of your arrangements, and there's some harmonic twists that you put in. Do you see any fruit of the Frank Zappa study in your own stuff?
Oh, that's a wonderful compliment. I think, well, when I sit down to write something, I guess there are any number of ways that stuff comes out, but I feel like every time I've sat down to write with an agenda, I usually still find myself, you can sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write something in this style.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've actually sat down to be like, I want to write something in sort of a Jeff Beck style. And then what actually comes out doesn't sound anything like Jeff Beck. Like nothing at all. So it's like I'm convinced that however we assimilate our inspirations and influences, I almost wonder how much control we really have over how much then becomes detectable, So what I would say, I feel like the biggest thing that I'm conscious of from Zappa and that I admire the most is his fearlessness and his unapologetic, like just do anything for any reason and it's all cool. I mean, he can write stuff for, that gets performed by, the Ensemble Moderne, but he can also write Baby Take Your Teeth Out, and all of them are relevant. He was just so, I won't compare, but like, or say superlatives, but you'd be hard pressed to find a more diverse creative force. Everything from doo-wop to like atonal noise music. It's like, I just love his unbridled creativity.
Yeah, it was all available. He didn't.
Yeah.
He didn't edit. He didn't edit himself in any way.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I hear in something like Valentino's Victory Lap, your tune, the stuff at the start and I think the end, is that in 5? I feel like it's kind of got an odd time before you start the heavy 4/4 riffing.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It's basically either, however you want to see it, 5 or 10.
Okay.
And it's funny because I actually did not write it to be tricky. Yeah. I wrote it first and I analyzed it later. And so I'm sure that's exactly the kind of thing that maybe came from the fact that I happen to love Frank Zappa. I happen to love Stravinsky. I was introduced to Stravinsky through I was actually just talking to somebody about this today, through the Disney movie of Fantasia.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, like
you remember that?
Many kids, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's where they would have first heard it.
Yeah,
Cool.
I mean, to this day, Rite of Spring and Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, still two of my favorite pieces of music. I can appreciate them, obviously a lot more deeply than I did at the time. But I would say it's why why something would kind of just come out without thinking about it that would be in an odd time.
Yeah, cool. Nice. Now, on that record, there's some really interesting techniques. Can I talk to you about some of those?
Sure, yeah.
Scrap metal. You're doing some really cool kind of slap harmonic stuff. Can you explain what's going on there?
Yes, I can. Actually, it's kind of a funny story. Okay, so my dear friend and who I've played with, and actually he guested on my album, Jude Gold.
Yeah,
he helped co-produce it.
Yeah, cool.
He is, oh my gosh, like such an amazing guitar player.
Yes.
And if you've ever heard him do his like slap guitar stuff,
Yeah,
it is like
it's insane.
it is so cool. And I remember seeing him do that, and I was like, I felt like I was like a little kid. I'm like, oh my God, you have to show me how to do that. And so I basically like forced him to sit down with me. I'm like, show me what you're doing. Show me what you're doing. And he would be like, okay. And he would show me, and he was showing me a slap technique. And he'd go bong, you know, and I would slap it the same way, and it would go beep, like a harmonic. And I was like, well, how, you know, and he'd be like, no, like this. You just want the clear note, bong. And I'd be like, beep. I'm like, how can, like, why am I not able to get this? And I realized, he's like, what are you doing? And then he started trying to do it. And he's like, how are you getting those harmonics? And I'm like, how are you not getting these harmonics? And then I actually realized, I started tapping up. I'm like, oh my God, you got a full dominant 7 arpeggio right here. You know, you've got your root, you've got your major third, you've got your fifth, and then your flat 7, just right up the string.
Awesome.
Blah, 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 you know?
And that's where your thumb position is along the string. That's where you're getting the different notes. Yeah, cool.
Exactly. And so, you know, if you slap right at where, you know, the octave would be, right? So halfway between the 12th fret and the bridge, that's right where your octave would be. And so just imagine, like if you were to imagine that your 12th fret is the nut, right? So you have all of your harmonics in the same place that you would anywhere else on the neck. So like at the 5th fret and, you know, stuff like that. So you have them just right there. In fact, you can play melodies with them. But in my frustration, I was going, you know, Jude, I can't get these notes. And he's like, you know what? Go with it. He's like, I don't know how you're getting all of those magical harmonics, but like, go with it.
That's cool.
And so I think we were actually, because he was helping me, you know, track some of this stuff, and I was just kind of messing around. And he was like, okay, what you are doing right now is so cool. And so it was kind of just a spontaneous thing I was doing, messing around, just showing him, look, I still can't get these notes right. And he was like, no, what you're doing is exactly right.
That's great. That's great. And in the tune, you add a little bit of bar to it. That sounds cool. That sounds really great.
Cool. Thank you.
Nice. Fading, another tune. You're doing these tapped arpeggios, but they're not tapped in the sense of, you know, like Eddie Van Halen 3 notes per string arpeggios. You seem to be like holding a chord shape, and are you using multiple right hand, you know, fingers in these passages? What's going on there?
Yeah. Okay, so that was, I mean, I think the first 2 tapping things I ever did are on that album. And Fading's the one that's the most, like, you know, most explored. Okay, so what I did on that was, I'm tapping with my 3 fingers of my right hand, my ring, middle, and index finger. Okay. And what I'm doing is, so I have 3 notes on my right hand, and then 3 notes that I'm hammering on my left hand. So because of the way, you know, harmonies work, a lot of harmonies can kind of melt into each other. And so what I'm doing is I'm tapping these notes to create one harmony, and then I'm moving one hand before moving the other, so that the harmonies kind of, half the harmony will move to create a new harmony, and then the other hand will catch up with it.
Cool. That's awesome. Yeah, it's got this real like a cascading kind of sound, so you can hear you can see hear the harmonies kind of blurring from one to the next. That's great. How did you come up with that?
That's That's a really good question. I think by not knowing what I was doing. Honestly, nobody ever sat me down and said, here's how you play eruption. So I think it's sort of a blessing in not, of seeing people do something, knowing like, okay, you can tap these notes. But I think some of it maybe comes about because anything that I ever do with any degree of speed, it's because I've worked it up to that speed. I think some people just have this natural facility of like, they can just, whatever, they can just play a bazillion notes and it's effortless. For me, it's like I'm disciplined. I can sit down with a metronome and I can get things up to speed. Yeah. But what that often means is that the lines that I tend to play up to speed have to sound interesting slowly, or I never would have had the impetus to want to get them up to speed.
Sure.
And so a lot of the things, of course now people have sat me down and are like, here's how you do this. Or I've now figured out like, oh, okay, that's easy to do really fast. But I wouldn't have necessarily in my exploration tried doing that, because while it may sound amazing up to speed as a fast musical gesture, playing it at, half or a quarter tempo wouldn't have necessarily been interesting enough for me to want to then stick with it for a long time. Okay. So I think fading came about of me kind of being like, oh, here's how I do this tapping thing. And then wanting to find something that was interesting and kind of realizing like, oh, wait, I can move this other hand, but keep these other notes kind of sustained. And then one harmony just kind of melts into the next one. And that's cool. And then I realized, I was like, but I don't want this to be fast. Like I didn't want to use tapping in that respect just to get more notes per minute. It was more that I wanted this very gentle sort of non-attack that is nicer with your fingers.
Cool. Now that album, Hail Souls, that came out in 2011. Now I've read a few interviews that you've done, and they always say, Gretchen's working on her second album or working on the follow-up. Where are you up to with that?
Okay, so that album, it's being mixed. The short answer is it's being mixed now.
Wow, cool.
And the more extensive answer is that it's a much bigger album than Hail Souls. And I don't say that as like a diss on my first album. I wouldn't have recorded anything if it wasn't honest.
Sure, sure.
But obviously, since Hail Souls, I've obviously been working every day to become at my guitar playing. And I've also continued to study composition, both by composing more. Also, I have a teacher.
Okay.
And so I'm always working on that. And so this next album is, I think, going to be about double the length of Hail Souls. I think it's like more than 70 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. And when you say you're studying composition, you've got a teacher. What sort of things are you doing? What are you checking out?
So a lot of what I studied in college, it's like, you sit there and you study counterpoint and, theory and harmony and stuff like that. But it's like, you realize, just because you studied it for, a year or semester in college, does that actually mean you can write a string quartet? It's like, okay, I wrote a string quartet in college and it was a minute and a half and I barely knew what to do. And reading in the alto clef, trying to play the piano was just like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, it's a lifetime to actually get these skills together. Yeah. And I realized that one of the things that I was constantly after is I kept thinking like, God, I wish that nowadays there was the kind of education that was available to composers of, 100 or 200 or 500 years ago,
Yeah, because everyone studied with someone. Hey, everyone found someone.
Right. Exactly. And I thought, and so I happened to, by total, like, I think, middle of the night Craigslist thing, I just very capriciously just Googled or just searched, composition teacher. And it's this girl, Elizabeth Erickson, and she is awesome. She studied at the Longy School of Music. And I think I read some student testimonials about her. And she's so cool because she's so, she's not dogmatic. But she's incredibly well studied, so she can sit there. I can send her a piece of music and without being like, oh, this is really good or oh, this is really bad. She's totally not judgmental on either level, which is great because it's like the idea is not to talk about like, oh, does my composition teacher like the piece? It's like, what's working, what isn't working, And so she could say something like, okay, between measures 16 going into measure 17, you cadence, but maybe what if you tried something that was a little bit less clean of a cadence? You've established this other harmonic vocabulary a little bit earlier on, and yet the cadence feels a little too straightforward. Maybe play around with that.
Cool.
Or hey, you've got direct fifths between your viola and your guitar in measure 8 moving into measure 9.
And that's a no-no, the parallel fifths.
Well,
unless you're a rock guitarist, and then that's all you do, And
then it's all you do. And this is what I love about her. She can definitely tell the difference between what is idiomatically correct. So a lot of times there'll be things where it's like, yeah, this is clearly a guitar riff. It's going to be parallel fifths and octaves all over the place. And then other times where I'm writing something that is a lot more just sort of incorporating the electric guitar into a more classical approach of composition. And then that's when you do notice and hear some of those things. And, sometimes you say, yeah, it actually sounds way better if I move in this kind of oblique way or in this contrary motion, or maybe, if nothing else, what it does is it makes you consider every note you write with greater scrutiny. And, if something doesn't hold up under scrutiny, whatever the reason for that scrutiny, it gives you the opportunity to make it better.
Wow.
So
that is so cool. What a great way to go about your composition and to have someone to bounce it off.
I can't even tell you what an incredible gift it's been. I adore her. And now I've also been working on my album with I don't know if you know Daniele Gottardo. He is he's been, he released a whole album of electric guitar with orchestral instruments, and that's actually why the person who, a good friend of both of ours, was like, you guys need to know each other. Like, cool. You're both working on similar stuff, and so he's been helping also with like the production of it.
Great.
And yeah, definitely understands the idea of blending electric guitar into kind of a compositional process. So
great.
Yeah, great to have people who know
so
more
good.
than I do giving me advice.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're really bringing, not to break into a binary thing, but you've had like two kind of very separate guitar disciplines. Yeah, it seems like you're bringing those kind of ideas together on the new album.
Yeah, you're absolutely right with that. And that's something that I've been wanting, it's something I had been wanting to do. And then actually the whole concept of this album came from, I don't know if you know Michael Melenda with Guitar Player Magazine. Yeah. He kind of brought forth this idea for a concept and was like, hey, what would you think of doing this? And it could not have been more along the lines of what absolutely resonated with me. In fact, I was just meeting with him about the project.
Wow, so that's great.
Yeah. So yeah, there've been some incredibly creative people, incredibly talented people, and people who have, helped in huge ways. I mean, Daniele is like, just from the guitar tracking alone, like, I don't think I've improved more as a guitar player in such a short amount of time. And yet I realized I've never actually had basically an amazing guitar player teacher sit with me while I tracked, my whole album, going like, check that, try this. I remember we did the first track we did, by 2 more days into tracking, he was like, you need to retrack the first one. You've improved too much the last couple of days. Like, which is amazing. It's like nobody, I feel like that once you've been playing for more than 5 years or something like that, you get used to this rate of progress that's so slow. And sometimes even seems like, I don't know, like you feel like it's always these really subtle, small changes over time, so that, you don't ever think like, oh my God, in 2 days, I just learned so much. It's what an incredible shock, and a pleasant shock.
Yeah, like you said, you get used to the progress, and if that exponentially changes or something inspires a push, that's really exciting. And the fact that you're still excited about that stuff, that's awesome.
Well, I mean, boy, what an endless and beautiful language is music.
Is there a timeline for the record to come out? It sounds amazing.
I think it's going to be, well, okay, so there are a few things that are out of my control. Like, I feel it's so funny because I feel like for, boy, literally a couple of years now, the whole thing has rested upon my ability to compose, prepare scores,
Okay. Yeah.
learn my own parts. My gosh, like I wrote all these parts and then I had to learn them, and definitely composer Gretchen is sometimes at odds with guitarist Gretchen, who's like,
Okay. Yeah.
Guitarist me is like thinking that composer me is totally unrealistic because evidently composer me thinks I'm a limitless virtuoso, and then I sit down to learn it. I'm like, what was I thinking? Why do I have to learn this?
That's great.
So, but now that I've actually done all that I can do, and we're in the mixing phase and the art phase, it's crazy to just kind of sit here and be like, oh my God. Like, it's not to say that I have nothing to do with the album. Obviously, I'm going to be approving mixes and having opinions on everything. But I think to answer your question, the best estimation I can come up with is what people are telling me,
Sure.
which is probably, sometime in like the early fall.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is, we're in the Southern Hemisphere. Oh, I am in the Southern Hemisphere.
Oh, okay, September-ish.
Yeah, cool. So early spring for us.
Okay, yes. Yeah.
Cool. Well, that's great. Well, that's not far. Definitely looking forward to hearing that.
Yeah. Oh, I'm looking forward to having it done. It's like I've been working on it for a while now.
Great. And will you tour that? Will you put a band together? Is it the sort of thing you could put a band together for?
That's a really good question. Yes, it's something we could put together. The amount of rehearsing will be substantial.
Sure.
Not just for me, but for the other instrumentalists, which I've learned. I never write music specifically to be difficult, but I think a lot of times I just assume that everything, I assume that if I could do something, then of course these amazing musicians I work with will have no problem sight reading it. But it doesn't always work that way. And also I'm becoming more, every day I'm learning how to write better for different instruments. So some things in retrospect, I'm like, wow, I really just was very brutal with my violinist. But, kudos to him. Like, he just killed it.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, it will be a lot of rehearsing. Yes, we do plan to tour with it, but it's not the same as putting a trio, rock trio together
sure.
and just hitting the road.
Sure.
So, and also I didn't want to limit the album by thinking constantly of how's this going to go live? How's this going to go live? I just thought, okay, I'm just going to do the album now, and then we'll figure out the live portion separately,
Yeah. So it is what it is, and then you can deal with that later.
It is. I mean, I know I can play the stuff. I did. So, but it's more just like realizing like the volume of, of everything,
sure.
that it's like learning 70 minutes of, because it's not riff based. It's not really, I mean, some of the songs have the intensity of like rock stuff, but it's all composed music. So I feel like, learning a 5-minute rock tune is a different amount of just, time and energy from learning a 5-minute classical tune,
sure.
Just simply based on like, the propensity for repetition and things
absolutely.
like that. So
in rock, yeah, two riffs, you've got a whole tune, whereas
right.
classical repertoire is very different.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Although with, like, say, Beethoven, I always think of him as a riff guy. If you listen to the Fifth, he's just sequencing like one riff, forever.
Oh yeah.
So that's a heavy kind of riff dude to me.
It is definitely, and you mentioned one of my favorites, and actually I have been studying. Last night I was studying the Second Symphony. And he's like, to me, he's like a mosaic composer. He'll have this idea, this motive, the da 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 da, and yet, from a player's perspective, that da 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 goes a million different places and develops in all these different ways. So it's a little bit different from da 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 da, that stays as itself.
Yes.
Really up until the very end, where there's that little variation da 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 da. But sometimes, at least what I'm noticing in my own music, is that can also pose its own challenges, because from a memory perspective, you can be like, oh, okay, well, it's that thing that's like that thing that happened earlier, but it's not. So, you know, in a way, your brain is wanting there to be a direct repeat, but then the composer in you is like, no, a direct repeat, that would be insulting to the listeners. Like, you know, you need to develop it in some way. You know.
Cool. That's cool. You bring that mindset in. That's awesome. Like, I mean, I've said it a few times. Can't wait to hear it. So, looking forward to that in the fall or the spring or wherever you're listening to this.
Yes.
Cool. Hey, I hate to shift gear. I feel like I'm lowering the tone of the discussion, but can we talk about your gear and guitars and stuff?
Of course. I'd love to.
Cool. I mean, of course, we're not lowering the tone. I mean, this is fun too. You've had a really long association with Music Man and a really interesting connection. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Okay. So, you know, for all of the ways in which people connect with companies, you know, mine was maybe a little bit different. The history between my family and the Ball family goes back to my dad being a Guitar Player magazine before I was born and writing a column called What's in a Name. And there he featured Ernie Ball.
Okay, yeah.
And that began my dad's association with the Ball family. And so Ernie had 4 kids, Sherwood, David, Sterling, and Nova. Sterling has since taken over the Ernie Ball company. But growing up, like, you know, I knew the Ernie Ball's grandkids. Like, you know, we hung out, you know, with the family. They weren't like, you know, we didn't hang out all the time, but like we were friends of the family. And so when I got in, you know, so like at NAMM shows, when I started getting interested in guitars, like we'd go and I'd want to hang out at the Ball booth because that's the family that I knew. And that's where, you know, and then it turned out Steve Morse and all these other really nice guys were Ernie Ball players, which just further solidified my interest in the music and interest in the company and stuff like that. So when I was wanting to buy my first guitar and I had saved up for it and I'd always been so adamant about, like, you know, just because my dad, like, you know, knew people, like, I'm gonna do this all by myself and blah blah blah. And so I had saved up money and I, you know, I wanted to buy actually a Steve Morse model. And basically they told me no.
How come?
They were like, you need a degree in electrical engineering to even be able to figure out the pickups.
Well,
they're like,
well, that's true.
What you want? They're like, what you want is a silhouette. And I was like, oh, well, can it be blue?
Like the Steve Morse was blue. That's great. Just to back up the Steve Morse, that had like the 4 pickups and was it like 2 or 3 switches?
Yeah, it's stuff that I can't even get my head around now, having played guitar. But, you know, and in fact, as much as I was a little bit, like, you know, disheartened by them, basically, I mean, they didn't, whatever. I'm sure if I really wanted it, they would have laughed and, you know, let me buy it. But they were like, no, here's what you want. You want a silhouette. And I remember they took me around the Ernie Ball factory and they kind of showed me, you know, different, you know, hey, look, here's this one body, and, you know, kind of showed me how things worked. And so I remember getting back and being like, okay, you know, and being on the phone with Sterling, and he was like, okay, I just talked to Ernie, and we're gonna give you the guitar. And I was waiting for the you know, X number of dollars. You know, I had a feeling they were gonna, you know, they'd made it clear that they were gonna give me some sort of, you know, discount, but I was expecting to pay for it. And he was like, no, Ernie wants to give it to you.
Wow.
And I remember being on the phone, just like dumbfounded. Okay, remember, you know, I'm a teenager. I've saved up like my life savings, you know, so I could get a guitar. I didn't even know how to play guitar at this point, but I knew I wanted to play guitar. And
you're getting the Ernie Ball factory tour, and you're not playing yet.
And they give me a guitar.
Wow.
And so even as, whatever, a snotty, you know, probably should have been ungrateful teenager, I was well aware of what an enormous gift that was.
Wow.
And I was deeply touched, and I never forgot. And ever since then, I always thought if I ever become a decent enough guitar player, if I'm ever worthy, basically they own me if they want. You know, like they did something that was so huge for me. at a time that they had no reason to believe in me. I was just, the kid of their family friend.
Yeah, right.
And they did something that was, the kind of gift you remember your whole life. And so I always sort of tried to stay in touch, but I wanted to be mindful about how to stay in touch because I never wanted it to seem like I was asking them for anything. And also, it's like when you're looking at a company who's like, oh yeah, our endorsees are Steve Morse, Steve Lukather, John Petrucci, Albert Lee, and you're going like, hi, anything I can do for you guys? It's like, of course. No, Gretchen, we're all set.
You got it covered.
Right, exactly. So I think my approach has always been, to strive to be worthy of the gifts that I've been given.
Awesome.
Yeah. And so actually I never, it was Jude Gold, my friend, who sent them my video for Valentina's Victory Lap. That was my first guitar.
Okay.
The Blue Burst, and my very first guitar. And I think he sent it to them kind of through the, one of his buddies, their connection, it wasn't to the Ball family because I was always like, don't bug them. I never want to seem like I'm asking for anything. And he, and apparently the guy there was like, oh, that's a pretty old guitar. And the next thing I knew, I had my white one. That's sort of the one with the bar that's become like my main.
Yeah. I see you playing that a lot. Yeah. So that's another silhouette.
Yeah, I have 3 silhouettes. Mm-hmm. 2 silhouette specials, 1 silhouette, and 1 Majesty.
Okay.
That's it's a 6-string Majesty. Though.
Okay. What's the difference between those the silhouettes?
Okay, so my first one, the silhouette has 24 frets, and it's got the fixed bridge. Mm-hmm. It is an older model, and then the silhouette special that I have, the one that's actually that one was photographed by Larry DiMarzio. It was recently. It's actually my Facebook profile photo right now, and it was on the cover of a Polish magazine.
Okay.
And that one, it's got the 22 frets, and that one has a fixed bridge. And then the main one that I've been using now has the 22 frets and the floating bridge. Okay. With the whammy bar.
Yep, cool. And are you using the stock pickups? I know you do some stuff with DiMarzio, but is that pickups as well?
Yeah. Okay. So the one that I'm using right now is all DiMarzio single coils. Yep. That's stock. I think DiMarzio's are stock in all of the silhouettes.
Okay.
Unless something's changed.
Cool.
In my other 2 silhouettes, the blue ones, I have a DiMarzio Fast Track 2 in the bridge position.
Okay, so like a humbucker, single coil size humbucker. Yes. Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool. And what are the single coils? The true single coils? What DiMarzio model's that?
You know what? I would have to look it up. They were the ones that just came in the guitar.
Okay.
I think they're just, what do they call them? Like, custom single coils or something like that. I actually don't know the model number.
I guess Music Man's speccing them out how they want.
Yeah.
Cool.
But that's a good question.
Yeah, great. And so you got the Music Man guitars. I know you play. Are you on a Les Paul for most of the Zapparella stuff?
Yeah, exactly. Is that, so obviously, it wouldn't be doing anybody a service to use the wrong guitar in a Zeppelin tribute band.
Sure,
so I have the Les Pauls and a Dan Electro. I mean, I know theoretically I could get away with a Telecaster, but I think the vast majority of people associate Jimmy playing the Les Paul.
Yeah. I remember as a kid being a little bit shattered when someone told me, no, he actually played the Stairway solo on the Telecaster. I'm like, really? But
that was the Telecaster that Jeff Beck gave him.
Oh, wow.
So
well,
there's some mojo.
That's got
in
some
that
cool
one.
going on.
Yeah.
Man. Well, I don't know. I'm an old guy, and old guys always end up playing a Tele anyway. So I've got a Tele style sort of thing. So
great guitars.
So I've caught up on some of that anyway. So that's cool. What about amps and things? What are you using there?
Okay, so I've got a number of different ones that I love for different reasons. So I have an old Marshall, a 1977 JMP.
Cool. Awesome.
50 watts.
Yeah.
That's what I used for a long time with Zapparella and, in various other projects. Recently, I got into 2-Rock amps.
Oh, yeah.
And I tried, they lent me an amp for this award show that I played at the NAMM show a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago. It's a 2-Rock Bionics. and it was like love at first note. It was just, it had so much of what I loved about the Marshall. But I found the feedback more controllable, and
Okay.
it just, you can talk all day about it, trying to describe what you love about it.
Sure.
But I feel like an amp is supposed to be your amp when you plug into it, and you're like, that's how it's supposed to sound. So I've been using the Two-Rock for Zapparella, and I have an Engel SE 670 with EL34s in it that I use mostly for my for most of my original music. And then I have an old Fender. My first amp ever is a 1966 Fender Reverb Deluxe that I actually got from a music store. It really was. It was another lucky thing of like a tiny little music store right by my college. And before I even knew what I was doing, and I went in and I had the guy at the store show me what the amps, he plugged in and demoed them because I didn't even know how to play anything. And I was like, that's the one that sounds good. And, of course I didn't have the money for it. So it's like, I would just come every week and be like, here's $20, here's $40. And eventually they were like, okay, take it. I'm sick of seeing you. Take your amp and be gone.
Nice. That's cool. Very cool. And are you still recording with that?
Yeah, I record most of pretty much all the clean stuff. Like fading was recorded on that one.
Okay, cool. Nice. You don't seem to use a lot of processing, or your last record at least. There didn't seem to be a lot of effects and things. Do you do much of that?
Right. For my my main pedal board for Zapparella, I've got an old Crybaby wah-wah pedal, and then I use I have a Providence chrono delay, which I love, and a Providence phase force that I use like in a couple songs like The Rover and a couple places where there's a little bit of phasing. And then I have an Exotic Effects AC booster. So that's what's on. Oh, and a tuner. So that's what's like on my pedal board right now. But I love Providence pedals. Like their overdrives, their delays, everything they make. I love. It's just a question of like how big can a pedal board be and how many boost pedals do you need tonight. I tend to like, as long as you're loading your own gear, like you're pretty lean and mean. So I have a pedal board that's exactly as big as I need it to be and no bigger.
Cool. So with the I guess with the Two-Rock, are you setting that up a little bit crunchy and then hitting it with the boost pedals?
Yeah, exactly. I'm setting it up for like a good like riff tone, and then I just hit it with the boost pedal for the solos.
Nice.
And sometimes I'll roll down the volume to clean things up, like when we play 10 Years Gone or whatever. I have to usually use the neck pickup at I don't know, maybe about 4 or 5 on the volume knob, depending on the night and the stage and stuff like that. And then I don't think that my guitar volumes are up at all the whole song. Okay. Just because it's a lot cleaner, and I don't like to go back and adjust my amp. Yeah.
That's
if I don't have to.
That's such an organic and cool way to do it. Rolling back the guitar, it's a lot of players don't know that, but there's just a whole shade of not only volume but tone and the gain hitting either your pedal or the amp, which has a huge difference. So that's a cool sound.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice. What about acoustics? I saw you playing some Django on the internet recently. The minor swing tune that was fun.
I love Django so much, and I always try to carve out a little bit of time in anytime that I'm not like under a huge deadline for something. I always try to have pure like recreational like music love study time. So like for no good reason I'm going to learn this thing because I want to learn it, or and it hit me that I was like, I have never learned a Django song. And this was right around the time that I got this new acoustic guitar from Stephen Strong, this Eros guitar, and the thing is amazing. I just love that instrument so much. And I was like, ooh, I mean, I know it's not a traditional gypsy jazz guitar, but I'm also not a traditional gypsy jazz guitarist.
Yeah, cool.
So I sat down really with the intention of just learning a few Django licks and being like, oh, I'd love to be able to improvise in this style. Maybe I'll go and I'll learn a little bit about the language through transcribing some licks. And then I got all maniacal about it. And next thing I know, I'd learned the whole solo, like note for note, or as note for note as I could hear it.
Cool.
And then I was like, oh, but the Stefan Grappelli solo is pretty cool too. And next thing I know, I learned the whole solo. and,
Right.
um, and it was like right around the time that I realized, like, okay, you know, my album's still going to take a little bit longer. It's been a long time since I've released
Hmm.
anything. And it kind of hit me. I was like, wait a minute. I'd love to get this acoustic guitar scene. I'm all excited about my Steven Strom
Yeah.
acoustic. You know, rather than do an infomercial of a, hi, everybody, here's my new
Yeah.
guitar and I
Yeah.
really love it and blah, 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 blah. It's like, it's a lot more meaningful to actually just make music with it and then
Sure.
let people decide for themselves what they think of it.
Great.
Um, and I realized, like, God, I'd been playing the song so much that I knew it really well. I'm like, I bet I could throw this down really fast in the studio. And so I went in the studio and it was really quick. I think it was the quickest thing,
Wow.
you know, that I've done. Just, you know, that I guess I'd been working on it and just playing it for the fun of it. And so
Yeah. Cool.
went in, threw it down, you know, obviously 3 tracks, the guitar, the rhythm, and then the 2 lead guys.
Yep.
And then, yeah, then just to sort of released it as a surprise. Probably nobody knew that was going to be what I was going to do thing. I mean, I know I've mentioned Django Reinhardt in interviews and stuff
Yeah.
before, but given that I had never learned a lick of his until, you know, much more recently, you know, I figured it might be a fun diversion from maybe what people were thinking.
Yeah, that's cool. And for people who might not know, Stefan Grappelli played violin in Django's band. So, how'd you
Yeah.
find the violin licks? Were they tricky to transcribe and then play on guitar?
They were a little bit obviously less guitaristic than the guitar stuff. The guitar stuff, all as you might expect, fell into the fingers fine. Django had 2 of them, so those of us who have 4 fingers, yes, we should be able to get those fingers, our fingers on the licks. I'm not to minimize it. Django's amazing, and the
Oh
fact that he was
yeah,
doing this
yeah,
with 2 fingers, oh my God! You know, some of those chromatic lines. Now I know he used. I didn't follow obviously his fingerings. Like
sure,
I need all my
yeah,
fingers. The Grappelli stuff, there was one section where I had to move it down an octave
okay,
just
yeah,
because of the range of the
sure,
guitar. But I found a spot that seemed to lend itself to doing that in a musical way. Yeah, some of the skips and everything for violin,
mm,
it was really fun to learn. I have to say, it was really, really fun. It was, you know, it doesn't fall into the fingers the same way that guitar stuff does, but it also worked for me at least well on the guitar.
yeah, cool. That's great. Um, so what's the acoustic you ran on that again?
That's a Steven Strom,
Yep.
Strahn,
Okay,
Eros.
cool. And what about nylon strings? Like you've got, um, yeah, what nylon strings you play?
Yeah, I have my traditional classical guitar is a Kenny Hill.
Yep.
It's a rock model, and then I also have a Sadowski nylon string electric
Ah,
that is
cool.
really cool and totally its own beast.
Nice. Is that a solid body?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
I think it's chambered. I think it may be chambered,
Okay.
but you know, from you know, as far as the way that it looks and
Yeah,
seems to
sure.
be is solid.
Gretchen, it's been so good talking to you. One thing I love,
So good talking to
you can
you.
talk about Zeppelin riffs, and then you can talk about Beethoven sequences or functional harmony. That's been a lot of fun to to be able to talk at that breadth. So that's heaps cool.
Oh, well, likewise. I mean, there's so many great, you know, music's such a beautiful language and there are so many cool
Yeah,
dialects,
yeah,
you know, and it's wonderful. Like, I love so much about so many different ones. And it's like, sometimes I feel like that the diversity of my interest prevents me from getting really good at one of them. But, you know, what can we do other than just follow where our loves and our interests lead us?
yeah. That's it. Cool. So what do you between now and the yeah album coming out? Have you got much on?
Yeah, I've got let's see, some Zapparella's playing some shows. I'm actually headed to Italy next week, and some my album mixing's happening there, so
Oh,
I'm gonna
okay,
check in on
okay. Yeah,
that.
great.
Yeah,
That's
and
exciting.
you know, and also just be in Italy because why not? Um, and let's see what else. Oh, I've been studying a lot of orchestration and getting very excited about that. So
cool. So you're still
a lot of study, a lot of practice. Yeah,
that's great.
More classical guitar practice recently, just because so much of my time had been very directed towards, album, everything for the album, which is great. But now that I'm kind of done with it, it's sort of like, okay, so what do I feel like doing now?
Yeah, that's cool.
And I realized that I miss playing classical guitar a lot. So that's been fun to be picking back up again and like relearning, some of the things that I had learned, years ago.
Yeah, that's great. And so what's the best way for people to keep up to date with your stuff, like your album and whatever else you're up to?
Okay, so I got a website. It's just gretchenmenn.com. Mm-hmm. I post on Instagram. Well, basically, my website has links to all my social media.
Okay, yeah.
I think I post most on Instagram. And then, I've got Facebook and Twitter that I kind of neglect, but, I try to remember to do it all. But,
sure. Great.
Yeah.
Well, that's cool. Well, yeah. Well, thanks again. Thank you again so much for your time. And, it's been so good getting to know
pleasure.
More about your career. As I said, I knew you as a rock player, but there's a whole... there's a whole iceberg beneath the surface of other stuff you've done and interests, so it's been really cool. So Gretchen Menn, thank you so much for coming on the Guitar Speak podcast.
Oh, it's so my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, there you go. That was our interview with Gretchen Menn. What a great musician. As I said, I'm really looking forward to hearing this new album and just seeing what sort of compositional depth she's gotten into, and as well as all the great playing and chops and tone that she's into as well. So as soon as we hear anything about that, we'll let you know. All right, it's just about time for us to get out of here. Now listen, if you want more of the Guitar Speak podcast, we've got a whole bunch of episodes you can access through iTunes, through Stitcher, or you can go to guitarspeakpodcast.libsyn.com and you can find all of our previous episodes. Hey, also remember to check out our Facebook page for details on the Michael Dolce workshops and also the giveaway stuff that's coming up very, very soon. If you're enjoying our episodes, and I really hope you are, please share them on your social networks or whatever you do. That really helps us get the word out, gets more people listening to our show, which is always good. All right, I'm out of here. Thank you so much. Thank you, Gretchen. And we'll talk to all of you next time on the Guitar Speak podcast. Bye now.